Hi, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you for joining us for our Ask Me Anything webinar today. As a reminder, this webinar is going to be recorded and we will have replays made available on our YouTube channel as well as TrustedSec.com. If you have any questions at any point during the webinar, please ask us using the Q&A function at the bottom of the window. And with that, I'm going to hand the reins over to our Managing Director of Advisory Services, Rick Yocum. So Rick, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Patrick. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. With me, I have Chris Camejo, who's our practice lead of compliance services and who's just generally our oracle of all things, regulatory and compliance. Chris, thanks for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So we know that CMMC has been talked about since 2020-ish, and we're all now thinking about CMMC 2.0. But, in the past year or so, we've gotten some additional clarity around regulatory details, timelines, that sort of stuff. So, I think we should really kick this off with covering some of the more maybe basic, but also more common questions that we get around CMMC. But to everyone who's joining us today, as we're talking, as Patrick mentioned, if you have more specific or complex questions that you want to hear about, definitely let us know using the Q&A function. We don't often manage to stump Chris on these topics, but I'm going to take all the help I can get on that front. So definitely don't hold back there. Chris, anything else you want to hit before we get into it?
Yeah, you mentioned the big updates that came out, and for anybody who's not following along, the big news is that CMMC 2.0 that was published way back, I want to say around 2021, finally got published in the Federal Register, put out for public comment. So that public comment period just closed on February 26th. So this is kind of a big milestone in the progress towards the CMMC rollout. Gave us a little bit more clarity about how they're planning to fill in some of the details there. But for the most part, the program hasn't changed too much from the original CMMC 2.0 draft that was put out.
Awesome. Cool. So, as far as the organizations that need to be worried about this, who does CMMC apply to? Let's just start there.
Yeah, so federal contractors, specifically Department of Defense contractors. That's it. That is the entire scope of CMMC right there. And then going a little bit deeper, it's specifically for Department of Defense contractors that are handling either federally controlled information, FCI, or controlled unclassified information, CUI. Those are kind of you can be a contractor and you don't necessarily need to be CMMC compliant unless you're handling one or both of those different types of information. And that could be either as a prime contractor to the DoD or a subcontractor anywhere in the chain of subcontractors that filters down from DoD. So if you're already handling FCI or CUI, you should already have those 15 basic safeguards from, I'm going to throw out a whole bunch of numbers here, FAR 52 20421 is like 15 basic safeguards for handling FCI. And I think I said federally controlled information. I'm sorry, it's actually federal contract information. Or if you're handling CUI, NIST 800-171 is the standard that you should already have a compliance program in place. You should have been self-assessing. You should be reporting your scores up to the SPRS system that feeds back into Department of Defense. The one big exception to all this is CMMC does not apply to any contractors or subcontractors that are operating systems on behalf of the federal government. So think of something like a cloud service. Those are already covered by a combination of FISMA and FedRAMP and NIST 853. So that is outside the scope of CMMC.
That's great. And, as far as CMMC and other regulatory stuff, right? I know we have some clients that are like, oh, I have ITAR stuff or stuff like that. Can you talk just really quickly around how, oh, this is the same, or oh, this is different, or help demystify some of the Venn diagram of that stuff?
Yeah, there is quite a bit of overlap when you get into CUI especially, that things like ITAR, by their definition, are export restricted, export controlled. And that is one of the categories of CUI is export controlled information. So you may end up with yeah, you're dealing with ITAR stuff, but that ITAR stuff is export controlled, and therefore it's also CUI. Or there's kind of a Venn diagram there with some overlap. The one big thing that CMMC does not apply to is straight up actual classified information. If it's got the like classified top secret on it, that is not a CMMC thing. That's a whole different game that you're playing over there. So this controlled unclassified information, it's right there in the name. It's unclassified information that the government still wants to control in some way. So this is kind of a step below actual classified information that we're dealing with.
So then like talk me through, what FCI and CUI are, what are the differences between these things? And, and how would an organization know if they even have it?
Yeah, so FCI is much more common. It's the definition of it, which I can show the definition from the official source here. So this is the definition straight from the Federal Acquisition Regulations. Just a little highlighted bit here. It's any information that is not intended for public release that is either provided by the government or generated for the government under a contract. So that is a super broad umbrella. FCI is just anything that was never intended to be made public. CUI is quite a bit more detailed. You can see here in the CUI definition, it's a big paragraph. Instead of reading all that stuff, the short answer is CUI is what a government agency says it is. It is on the government agencies to define CUI in accordance with their own internal regulations. And then whenever they decide, okay, we need to share this CUI with some sort of contractor, they put clauses into the contract that say, hey, we're sharing this CUI with you. You need to protect it to this standard. Today, that standard is NIST 800-171. In the future, it's going to be CMMC. So, so yeah, that's pretty much it. Is CUI is what the contract says it is. There's a list that National Archives maintains, and I can share that as well here. That there's all these different categories of CUI. And you can see here's the export controlled one that we mentioned, and we can click on that and see that there's a whole bunch more information in here about the types of markings that it would have and any sort of notes about what it is. The most common thing that organizations dealing with CMMC will run into, besides export controlled, is this one for controlled technical information. And this is kind of the legacy of an older kind of class, I don't want to say classification, categorization from the Department of Defense that CUI is basically the catch-all where all these different agencies used to have their own categories. They've all now been rolled up into CUI where these are all different types of CUI. So there's one set of requirements, NIST 800-171, to protect all these different types of information.
That's great. And I think it's probably worth repeating, organizations, really they only have CUI if their contract says they have CUI. It's always going to be in there, whether it's directly in there, if you're a direct contractor, or if you're a sub from other organizations, right? And there's flow down provisions.
Yep.
It doesn't, the CMMC stuff doesn't necessarily apply to you unless that's flagged specifically, right?
Yep. And they will flag it in a very specific way. So there are these two contract clauses, those numbers that I was throwing out earlier, and we'll actually start with the one for FCI. If you are handling FCI, this is that FAR 52-204-21 that I started throwing numbers out earlier. And anytime you get a contract that includes FCI, you can see here at the top, insert the following clause. This entire clause needs to be included in that contract word for word. So that is your big warning flag that, hey, you are about to get FCI as part of this contract. So the nice thing to search for here is the basic safeguarding of covered contractor information systems. That's your title for this clause. When we get into CMMC today, there's this DFARS clause, 252-204-7012, same thing. Safeguarding covered defense information and cyber incident reporting is the magic text string you're looking for in your contracts. and it should have this entire block of text pasted into your contract somewhere. So if you don't have this whole wall of text in a contract, you are likely not handling CUI today. This is going to change when CMMC rolls out, because right now CMMC effectively doesn't exist because it's still in that regulatory process. So this is the old clause that requires you to do NIST 800-171. When CMMC rolls out, we're going to get a new clause, 252-204-7012, which is much shorter and sweeter, that just says do CMMC stuff, basically. So you do not have to do CMMC unless you get a contract that contains this exact clause copy pasted word for word.
Well, and I think you brought up another great point in the midst of that too. The SP 800-171 stuff, right? There are requirements there that do actually predate the CMMC stuff and technically are in effect now, right?
Exactly. Yeah. 171's been around for years, so everybody should already be doing that. And there's quite a bit of overlap there where CMMC level 2 is NIST 800-171. That's it. They just took the 800-171 requirements and relabeled it CMMC. CMMC level 1 are those 15 basic safeguards from that FAR 52-204-21, the one for FCI. All of those 15 safeguards are also part of NIST 800-171. So if you have a good 800-171 compliance program today and you've been self-assessing and reporting to SPURS, effectively you're almost CMMC compliant. The big difference between 800-171 and CMMC is that number one, CMMC's added a new level 3. And level 3 is NIST 800-172, which is a new standard that's basically just a few add-on requirements that kind of extend the requirements that are already in 800-171. So if you have to extra protect information, now you've got some extra controls you can tack on there. The other big difference is 171's always been a self-assessment program. CMMC, some organizations will have to do audits rather than self-assessing. They got tired of people saying they were compliant when they actually weren't, so they're trying to crack down on that. And then the other big change is in the scope, where in 800-171 and the old rules for FCI, the scope is just the systems that are directly storing, processing, or transmitting FCI or CUI. CMMC expands that scope so that now it's not just the systems that are handling that information, other systems that are on the same networks that can affect the security of the systems that are handling CUI, not FCI, just CUI, are in scope. So you may find that, yep, our 800-171 program, totally compliant, everything's great, we're ready for CMMC, but then because you don't have a firewall between your 800-171 stuff and the rest of your network, you've just dragged the rest of your network into scope for CMMC and caused a bunch of headaches. So that'll be the biggest struggle as you transition over to CMMC.
Well, in terms of the as you transition to CMMC, what's that rollout timeline look like? And I guess as part of that, are there any particularly long poles in the tent, things that if someone doesn't have it in place, they really should start thinking about? Let's start with the timelines and then we'll get to the other one.
Yeah, yep. So the big thing that just happened is that public comment period closed on February 26th. So that's right now the government's going through looking at all those public comments and making decisions. And eventually a final rule will be published. And we don't know what that date is. Typically, it's going to be many months. It could be a year. But all of the rollout timeline phases are all based on that date. When that final rule is published, and that clause that I just showed, that 7021 clause that says you're going to do CMMC things, becomes real. That's the date at which this whole rollout timeline starts. It's going to be a phased rollout. And the biggest thing that everybody should know right away is it's not like that final rule is going to get published and suddenly everybody who already has a contract has to be CMMC compliant the next day. Any existing contracts you already have are not going to change. They're not magically going to grow CMMC compliance clauses when that rule gets published. You get to ride out any contracts that you already have. The exception being if you've been awarded contract options, there's a few ways that this rollout is going to interact with those options rather than actual signed contracts. So it's a phased rollout, 4 phases. The first one begins on that effective date when the final rule gets published. And they're going to start putting level 1 and level 2 self-assessment clauses in all new contracts that actually include FCI or CUI. So not every contract will have these, just contracts that relate to FCI or CUI will get these self-assess clauses. So in order to win those contracts, you have to show that you're CMMC compliant. They may, at their discretion, require a level 1 or level 2 self-assessment to be awarded an option that was previously won. And there may be level 2 audit requirements, but we expect that's another kind of at their discretion. We expect that to just be in a few contracts. So for the most part, phase 1, new contracts or exercising options, level 1 and level 2 self-assessments. 6 months after that, phase 2 starts. And that's where they're going to start rolling out the level 2 audit requirements in all of the contracts that need level 2 audit requirements because of the type of CUI that they handle. Maybe a little more sensitive data than what only requires a self-assessment under level 2. And same thing with the options that to exercise an option, you may have to do your level 2 audit to do that option. And there may also be level 3 audit requirements in a few contracts. Again, totally up to DoD's discretion. We don't know how many of these that they're going to put out, but probably the more sensitive things. Calendar year after that. So now we're a year and 6 months after the final rule gets published is when phase 3 starts. Level 2, you're going to have to have the audit done in order to exercise any previously awarded options. Level 3 audits will be in all new contracts that warrant them. And the one thing that you have, though, is the level 3 audits may be delayed until you exercise an option. You won't have to do it right when you sign the option award. And then finally, level 4 happens a whole nother year after the start of phase 3. So now we're 2.5 years after the final rule gets published. And that's when, okay, everything's all up. Every contract will have C clauses. Everybody needs to have the appropriate self-assessment or audit for whatever contract they're being awarded or whatever options that they're being awarded or exercising. So long rollout, 2.5 years, quite a bit of time to get ready for that final phase.
Right. And it's also fair to say, I think that if, again, all of this is going to be highly contract specific and specified in the contracts that people are getting. It's good to know the time frame up front, but also, people that are working directly with, say, the DoD, they have a contracting officer that should also know a lot of this stuff, and that questions can be lobbed at for specifics associated with contracts or exercise options and how they're going to change. They might not have all the answers yet either, but for things that are kind of in flight but might change slightly, probably the way to go to get additional information on that stuff, right?
Yep, exactly.
Great. Well, so you mentioned audits, and I know another question we get quite a bit is, well, who can help audit me, or who can help get me ready for CMMC? And I know there's a bit of a difference, between the answers to those two questions. So do you want to lay some of that out for us?
Yeah, so there's kind of 2 main organizations that that most contractors are going to care about: the RPOs and C3PAOs. RPOs, it's an acronym for Registered Practitioner Organizations, and these are the organizations that help you build out your CMMC compliance program and get ready. That's what TrustedSec is, and then individually, we're individually certified as RPs, registered practitioners. So we go through training with CMMC. We're up to date on the rules. C3PAOs are certified third-party assessment organizations. They're the ones that do the audits. And there's not many of them right now because the process to become one is sort of a hassle. And with this slow rollout, nobody really wanted to commit to go jump through all the hoops and then have to sit around and do nothing for a few years. So there's not that many of them right now. But one of the big rules to be aware of is if an organization is helping you get ready as an RPO, they shouldn't be the one auditing you as a C3 PAO. So not really going to be a one-stop shop thing. You need some kind of avoid some conflict of interest there of hire an RPO organization to help you get ready, and then be prepared to get a different C3 PAO to actually audit that once you're ready to go. If you even require an audit, again, level 1, all self-assessments. Level 2, some organizations will have to do an audit, but we expect most will be able to self-assess.
Got it. And that structure seems pretty standard for a lot of compliance or regulatory things, right? If you're helping to design the controls, you shouldn't be put in a position to grade your own work.
Exactly. Yep.
Great. If some organizations are seeing like CMMC requirements somewhere, somehow, in some form, but then you're saying, well, this isn't rolled out yet. How's that
Yep.
working, right? Because some organizations have mentioned, oh, but so and so told me I have to do the thing now.
Yeah, this drives me nuts. We've seen quite a few large defense contractors that pay enough lawyers to know better, that are putting these CMMC clauses in their contracts or their subcontracts. And the reality is CMMC legally does not exist today, and it does not exist until that final rule is published in the Federal Register. That is how the federal regulatory process works. So they're telling you to be compliant with a standard that doesn't even legally exist. Um, on top of that, they're not using those clauses that I just showed, the actual DFARS clauses. So they're not telling you what CUI you have to protect. They're not telling you what level you have to protect it to. They're not telling you whether you need to self-assess or audit. So they're really nonsense clauses where they're saying you need to be compliant with something that doesn't exist yet, and we're not going to tell you what part of that compliance you're on the hook for. So they drive me nuts. We get those calls all the time from clients that they're freaking out because they think they have to do this or they're going to lose all their contracts next week. And it's just a whole bunch of FUD from some of these big defense contractors. So hate it, hate it. If going back to the whole thing, if you don't see those DFARS clauses word for word in your contract, it's not a real CMMC clause. And I know this may be hard to do, but I would push back on whoever's sending that contract to you and ask them the hard questions. Oh, I see you've got a CMMC clause in here. What CUI are you going to be sending back to? And my guess is they're going to start stumbling and hemming and hawing because they actually don't know that clause is meaningless.
Right, right. And I think that's another super critical point, that ultimately this regulation is a follow the data type regulation, right? And so the scope of your controlled unclassified information could change from system to system based on what the contract says is in scope. If there's certain engineering drawings that are in scope, that might take one route. If it's certain shipping locations that are in scope for controlled unclassified information, that might route through different systems, different people. And it's going to be really important that organizations understand, oh, okay, based on the contract, my CUI are these specific things, because if you don't have that, you're not going to know, well, where do I need to apply these controls? And in lieu of that, you're left potentially trying to apply these controls maybe to an entire environment. And we know that with some exceptions, often that way lies madness, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would happily say that my house is CMMC compliant right now simply because I know there's no CUI in it. So yeah, I'll sign all the contracts you want saying I'm CMMC compliant. It's if there's CUI here, there's nothing to protect. There's nothing to put these controls around. So yep, I'm compliant.
Right, right. But once you have a contract that says that that floppy disk that's running Oregon Trail in the background is CUI, well, now you have to do some stuff to, your office space or the computer and where you store it and all that stuff, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Well, from a broader scope perspective, right? When we're talking about sort of the fact that you've used this term before, and I love stealing it, that, some of this stuff can be kind of contagious, or the requirements can become contagious. What does that really mean? So when it's, hey, anything that has or touches or impacts CUI plus anything that impacts the security of that stuff, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so let's start with FCI because that's the easy one. FCI is not contagious. So FCI still plays by the old rules of the only thing that's in scope for level 1 are the things that are directly storing, processing, or transmitting FCI. So those 15 basic safeguards, they're so simple. They're all common sense things. My recommendation for most organizations is just apply those 15 basic safeguards, the level 1 controls across the entire organization. So you don't even have to think about where FCI is going and isn't going. And it's just stuff you should be doing anyways, like having passwords. Level 2 is where we get into the contagious thing. Level 2 is all about CUI. And so they've broken things down into 5 categories. Category number 1, anything that stores, processes, or transmits CUI, they label it as a CUI asset. And that thing needs the entire list of CMMC controls applied to it. There's sort of a carve out, and this is our second category, for weird things that are really hard to fully secure. So especially when you get into like manufacturing, you'll have all sorts of like CNC machines that are, yeah, you're feeding them data, like you're feeding them the instructions that could be considered CUI to go cut a machine part. But those things you can't really run antivirus on a CNC machine. So all those weird like IoT and OT things, government equipment, they call those specialized assets. And those have to be risk managed. They don't need the full set of CMMC controls. Anything that provides security for a CUI asset, they categorize as our third category, which is a security asset. So your domain controller that's doing all your passwords, your firewalls, your antivirus dashboard, those all need the full set of CMMC controls on them because they're protecting the things that have the CUI. Our fourth category, and this is where the contagious part comes in, anything that is not physically or logically separated from a CUI asset is in scope and also has to be risk managed. So that's where my example earlier of you've got your system that's always had CUI on it sitting on your network. You made it NIST 800-171 compliant. Everybody's happy. But now because CMMC changes the scope rules, everything else on the same network as that box is now dragged into scope. Doesn't need the full set of CMMC controls, just like those specialized assets. We manage the risk. We do what we need to control those. And the fifth category is completely out of scope. And they say to be out of scope, it has to be, first off, it cannot be in any of the other categories we just listed, and it must be physically or logically separated from CUI assets. So physically separated is you've got 2 different sites. We've got our office here that is no CUI ever goes to the office. Great. And then we've got our manufacturing plant where there's CUI, 2 completely separate physical locations. Great. Office isn't in scope because there's no CUI there and it's physically separate. But let's say your office and your manufacturing are in the same facility. They're not physically separated. They're on the same network. That's where our logical separation comes in. And for the most part, that just means firewalls, that you've got a firewall between those CUI assets and you want to keep out of scope, and you don't let the out of scope things talk to the CUI assets at all. And you may end up with things in between. So say your Active Directory server that's doing all the passwords for everything on that network. It's okay to have a single domain controller that handles both the CUI assets and the out of scope assets. It just means that that domain controller, because it's providing security for the CUI assets, it's a security asset, has to have the full set of CMMC controls on it. But your domain controller isn't handling CUI itself, so it's not contagious. It doesn't spread that scope to all the other systems that it's doing password stuff for. And it's totally fine to have different sort of areas within your network firewalled off where you may say, okay, here's our area that we handle CUI in, but maybe you have some level 3 CUI and you don't want to make everything level 3. So let's make another little firewalled area just for handling level 3 CUI. Maybe you make an area for those shared services like your domain controller that need kind of 1 foot in the CUI world and another foot in the out of scope world. So you can do some things with firewalls there that let you get creative and keep that scope to a minimum. But the big thing is CUI assets are contagious. Anything that can communicate with a CUI asset gets dragged into scope, at least as a risk managed asset.
Right, right. Well, and I think the thing that I would double down on there really is your discussion about firewalling and zoning things off. Essentially, I know some of our smaller clients we'll talk to and we'll say, hey, talk to us about how you're set up, and I'll say, oh yeah, we have a firewall between this thing and that thing. But the point you made that I want to make sure is super clear is, it's not enough to just have the firewall. You have to actually have the rules that effectively manage the access from one zone to another zone. So putting a firewall there and throwing up an any rule and letting it fly doesn't actually get you where you need to go. It's a step because the tool's there, but you need to make sure the tool's implemented in such a way that the traffic's going to be restricted to really actually implement that control.
Exactly. Yep.
You mentioned risk managed a number of times, especially for some of those specialized assets in particular. What does that look and feel like? It feels kind of gray, and what's CMMC really expecting for that risk managed stuff?
Yeah, so the easy way to do this is a risk assessment, which there already is a CMMC requirement that says you have to do a risk assessment on everything. So this is really how this is driven is you do the risk assessment to figure out what are the risks posed by those assets to CUI, and then implement appropriate controls from CMMC to manage that risk. Risk assessment for people who haven't done it is often a confusing topic. So the kind of boiling it down to its basics, it's make a list of the threats that exist to these things. So hackers, phishing, malware, ransomware, somebody physically walking in and plugging a USB stick in to install a backdoor. So think through all these different sort of scenarios that could present risks to those assets. And then think about the likelihood and potential impact of each of those threats. And the impact is regardless of the likelihood. You may have something that you think is incredibly unlikely, but if it happens, so you want to document that, incredibly unlikely, but if it does happen, this is going to knock us out of business. Versus the little things that happen all the time, very low impact, but they're so frequent, they're very likely. And there's everything in between. You may have high likelihood, high impact, low likelihood, low impact. That helps you organize those risks and prioritize them and figure out which ones you should actually be worried about. And that's what needs to drive your decisions about which of the CMMC controls you're going to put onto those specialized and risk managed assets that are in scope.
Oh, God.
A good spot to look for this is NIST 800-30 is a step-by-step process for doing a risk assessment. Looks like a big document, but there's a lot of just kind of stuff in the beginning about what a risk assessment is. When you get into it, there's a step-by-step process. And then down in the appendices, there's a whole lot of like charts and tables that kind of give you pre-made information that can help you perform that assessment.
So, we work with, actually, before I get to that, I see a question. Let's hit that. If a security protection asset is outside of the CUI enclave, is it also contagious? Is the question we have.
Nope, as long as it does not have CUI on it itself.
Yeah, so only the things that, store or process or transmit CUI, those are the contagious things, the things that help protect CUI. They can be anywhere, and the things that they touch don't necessarily don't bring other things in scope, essentially, right?
Right. Yep.
Great. So, we help a bunch of organizations with risk assessments in general. And, there's a couple places where I see people get wrapped around the axles, right? On the risk assessment stuff. So if risk managed basically means doing a risk assessment to understand some stuff, and from a CMMC perspective, you need to do one anyway. I thought it might be worth diving in to just a couple pitfalls or questions that we commonly see come up with that.
Yep.
the first one really is like, where do you draw the line, right? Because at some point there's a real difference between documenting your 10 highest risks and your 100 highest risks and your 100,000 highest risks, right? Because theoretically it could never stop. There's always going to be another thing you could put on the list, even if it's super low likelihood and super low severity. So how do you typically talk people through making sure that they are thinking about or identifying and documenting the risks that need to be documented, but not wasting a bunch of time on stuff they really shouldn't be wasting time on?
Yeah, so that's kind of that first step there. The threat likelihood and impact is where you deal with most of that. Is when you're making your list of threats, think of it as a brainstorming session. Jot down everything that occurs to you, but you'll be able to quickly rule out quite a few of those based on likelihood and impact. So the my favorite example is we're assessing a facility in Kansas, and is there a threat of a volcano popping up in the parking lot? Not really. Like, put it on the list, likelihood effectively zero. Versus if we were talking about Hawaii, that might be a very different story. Like, yeah, there totally could be a lava flow like running through the facility one day. So those are the kinds of things to think about is and extending that to the digital world as well. Think about the things that are affecting your organization already, the ransomware attacks, the phishing emails, the employee that accidentally mistypes an email address and sends sensitive information to somebody they didn't mean to send it to. Start there. Start with the things that are already happening. Look at what's happening to other organizations. Look at breach reports to see how are these attackers attacking, especially how are they attacking organizations like us, so that you can add those to your list. They haven't happened to you yet, but if they're happening to your neighbors, you should be worried about it, and work your way down from there. Beyond that, a risk assessment is really kind of a living document. So the first time through is the hardest because you're generating this list from scratch. As you go back and you refresh it every year, that's where you can go back and okay, let's make it a little better this time. So maybe last year we just said we're worried about hackers. This year, let's break it out and talk about a few different types of hacking, and maybe those have different likelihoods and impacts based on how exactly those attacks would go. Or maybe you start adding a few of the much lower likelihood events that I still wouldn't worry about the volcano in Kansas, but you may have the events that are not too likely, but are super high impact that you might want to start considering as your risk management process gets more mature, and you
Yeah,
just build it out over time.
that's great. And I think the part you mentioned about, the risk index or risk register being a living document is so important. I think a lot of people get into this and think I need to, the regulatory requirements suggest that I have to have a perfect risk register right out of the gate. You have to do your due diligence on it, right? You have to go far enough. But, if you have some broad category risks and you're actually thinking through them and you're doing the right follow-up and trying to mitigate those risks, even if they're not fully itemized, even if there might be one or two nuances or details that you're missing in that first swing, that's typically not going to be a huge issue, right? To your point, you come back in a later year, hey, let's focus on some of these, let's expand upon these. Oh, hey, we forgot this before. You make it better over time. The intent here for a lot of this risk management stuff is to build rhythms and habits and patterns to make sure people aren't just forgetting about things, or just completely missing things and kind of not even trying to think through them. So I think, don't don't sweat the small stuff too much in terms of building out this risk register. As long as you're taking a legitimately good swing at it, you're gonna be able to check those boxes, right?
Yeah, and this is where NIST 830 comes in again, is the appendices. There's one appendix in there that has a reasonably good list of things to consider as threats when you do this the first time. So start with what NIST 830 has your first time around, and then yeah, you're probably going to rule some of them out. You may think of things you want to add to their list. That's a great first start, and then over time you can keep tailoring that list as you go through your risk management cycle.
Right, right. Um, I also have worked with some clients before that struggle to think through risks, like one-time risks versus risks in the aggregate. And sometimes that can be kind of a thorny challenge. So maybe if something happens once or twice, it's negligible. It's almost like people taking an extra $10 from a petty cash drawer. Um, but if it happens 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, oh, that now hits a materiality threshold of sorts. Do you have any thoughts about how to think through or how to deal with, individual risks versus risks in the aggregate, and how you can bubble up some of that stuff in a risk register?
Yeah, and that's where likelihood comes in. Again, 830, there's appendices, there's kind of a sample likelihood scale that they have in there. And I should mention, we've got, there is a blog post up on the TrustedSec blog that we did a while back about kind of a step-by-step for risk process, or an overview of a risk management process, that a lot of the examples we used in that blog post were pulled from 830. But one of the ways that 830 shows to express likelihood is as a frequency. So high likelihood could be, and I'm making up numbers here, I don't have it in front of me. High likelihood could be something that happens daily, versus medium likelihood is something that happens yearly. We're within a certain, from between 10 and 100 times a year. And then as low likelihood, okay, we're talking about something that happens between 1 and 10 times a year. So that addresses what you're talking about here is, yeah, we can worry about the event that may happen once a year and costs us $1 million when it happens, or we can worry about the event that costs us $10 when it happens, but happens 100,000 times a year. At the end of the day, or at the end of the year, actually, the cost of both of those ends up being the same when you math it out. So that's where this likelihood and impact comes in, is you can use that likelihood as a frequency to say, like, yeah, this thing happens too much. It ends up costing more than the big scary thing that happens rarely.
Right, right. So back to CMMC and CUI and all this fun stuff. Another thing we hear a lot is, well, what level should I be targeting? What's everybody else doing? Or, what's the right way to prepare now before I actually have any contracts that apply? Like, how far should I really go at this point?
Yeah. So if you're only handling FCI, no CUI involved, go to level 1. If you don't expect to handle CUI, there's no point in going to level 2. So that's a great place to start. If you do have a NIST 800-171 program today, you are handling CUI, go straight to level 2. And that's going to be easy-ish to do, because again, level 2 is 800-171. We really just need to deal with the scope issues and some of the other nuances there. Level 3 is very new. I think I mentioned that level 3 is based on NIST 800-172, which is brand new, just released a few months ago, or was it sometime last year? Time flies. Brand new standard that nobody's really doing yet because it's so new, and it was just kind of created to be CMMC level 3. So we kind of, just from the noises we've heard around the community, which could all just be rumors, the guess is that level 3 requirements are not going to be all that common. So this is one where, if you have a contracting officer, somebody you can reach out to and ask, like, do you think we're going to need to do level 3 for these kinds of contracts? Okay, go ahead and do level 3. Otherwise, for most organizations, go for level 2 if you're handling CUI. Level 3 is just a few kind of enhanced add-ons to the existing 800-171 controls. So it shouldn't be too much effort to step up from level 2 to level 3 when the time comes.
Got it. And, based on the level that you go for, and if you need an audit, what's going to drive that? Like, what are auditors going to be really focused on or looking for or digging into?
Yeah, so this is an area where we actually have quite a bit of background on, because this is all descended from NIST 800-171. The CMMC's put out some scoping guides and assessment guides, that all these things I've been talking about scope, go grab the CMMC scoping guide. That explains everything that I've been talking about in a lot more detail. There's a nice little table in there that shows the different categories of assets. But they've put out an assessment guide, and I can bring that up here. for each of the different levels. So this is the level 2 assessment guide, and I've just picked a random CMMC requirement here of unsuccessful logon attempts. And their control is, it's 4 words, super vague. Limit unsuccessful logon attempts. What the heck does that mean? And this is word for word out of NIST 800-171, by the way. So 800-171 has an accompanying document called NIST 800-171A that provides assessment objectives for the assessors. And you can see that they have just pasted that straight in here into the CMMC assessment guide. So these are literally the instructions for the assessor that I want to see if you've defined the means of limiting unsuccessful logon attempts. I just need to see a document that says, yeah, after 10 logon attempts, we're going to lock them out. They don't tell me what number it has to be here, so I don't care. You could tell me 100, you could tell me 5. As long as you've defined it, I'm going to check the box on this one. And then part B, you've actually implemented that. So, okay, let's go look at your system. I'm going to try to log on 11 times because your policy said 10 and make sure that I get locked out and I can't try that 11th time. If that's true, if you match your own policy, great. You've passed this control. You've limited unsuccessful logon attempts. So, and even there, the things that I'm looking at, you can see here the potential assessment methods. They tell us exactly what to look at. I'm going to look at your access control policy and procedures for things related to unsuccessful logon attempts. I'm going to interview people. I want to hear people make noises. Hey, what happens if you try to log on a bunch of times? Oh, I get locked out. It's obnoxious. I hate it. Great. That's what I want to hear. And then test. They're telling me to watch over somebody's shoulder and watch somebody actually try to do this. So this is the cheat sheet right here. Tells you what the auditor's trying to determine and what they're going to check to determine that. Everything below here, this discussion, this is, again, you can see from the header, they pulled this straight out of NIST 800-171. This is not the requirement. This is just guidance. This is helping you understand the requirement. Don't feel like anything in here is something specifically you have to do. And then further discussion is something that CMMC decided that NIST 800-171 didn't say enough. So they've added their own little further discussion section to each of these with a little extra detail. And they've also helpfully put some examples in here that I really like. Sometimes I feel like these are more helpful than the guidance up above, and some potential assessment considerations, other things for the assessor to think about. So a ton of great information here in the assessment guide. This is your roadmap to how to pass the audit.
That's great. That's great. So, we work with a lot of large organizations that have huge teams that can, that might already have a lot of this stuff in place or might be able to put it in place quickly. We also work with a lot of much smaller organizations that don't necessarily have dedicated compliance teams or even dedicated security teams. And so how does a small company reconcile the effort, to put this stuff in place? And doubling back to one of the questions I mentioned before, are there specific requirements that are top of your mind that that might jump out as being maybe particularly onerous or things that they might want to get ahead of sooner rather than later?
Yeah. So the key thing there, when you're a small organization, there's a big decision you need to make. There's no CMMC requirement that says you have to do those things we were talking about with firewalls and separating out your CUI assets from everything else. You could just go all in and say, okay, that's it. We're going to risk manage the entire network. And if you're small enough, you might be able to get away with that. Bigger organizations, that's a lot harder. On the other hand, if you look at that and you just say, wow, like if we try to implement all of these requirements on everything in our organization, it's going to be disruptive to our business. It's going to be expensive. Our users are going to revolt. That's where it's time to start thinking about, okay, let's slap some firewalls in there. The word enclave gets thrown around a lot, which is just a fancy way of saying, take your CUI assets and firewall them off from everything else. So build that enclave, put your CUI assets in there, and minimize the number of things that can talk to those CUI assets to just make your scope absolutely as small as you can to minimize that cost of compliance, minimize the disruption. for most organizations, chances are it's going to be a lot cheaper to build that enclave than it will be to try to make the entire environment CMMC compliant and do your risk assessment on absolutely everything and try to, it's a big scope that way.
Yeah. And when you say cheaper, I mean, it's cheaper in two ways, right? There's the hard costs associated with, events per second and monitoring logs and, dollars out the door because you're paying a vendor or a tool to review stuff potentially. But
Per
then there's
user
also,
licenses.
yep, licenses. And then there's also just the operational costs of doing the access reviews, the level of frequency of vulnerability management and patching and stuff like that, which, outside of, the enclave, you might have more lax requirements based on your risks and stuff, right? So it's both hard dollars and kind of these soft operational dollars that we're talking about that minimizing the scope can help with, right?
Yep. Yeah. And this goes beyond technology as well, is besides like firewalling things off, you also need to think about business processes. So a large number of small organizations we work with, they're just emailing CUI around. And when you start thinking of the implications of that, okay, like as soon as CUI goes through your email server is now a CUI asset, which means whoever's getting that email with CUI, yeah, their workstation and potentially their mobile device, if they get email on their mobile device, are also CUI assets, and they're contagious. And so because your mail server is getting CUI, everything in your organization that gets email, including everybody's mobile devices, is now an asset that needs to be risk managed because your mail server is contagious. So beyond the technology, it's worth thinking about our business processes of, if we just set up like a file share portal and stop emailing CUI, we can take our mail server out of scope. We can take all those workstations out of scope. And now the only people that are in scope are the ones that actually need to access that CUI. They go retrieve it from the file share portal. So small adjustments to how you handle CUI can have a huge impact on your scope when you combine it with these enclaves and isolation, logical separation.
Yeah, and that can't be overemphasized. Sometimes the easiest path through this stuff is changes to business process as opposed to major additions to security controls and tools and stuff like that. Not always easiest, but sometimes way easier than trying to apply some of these controls across the board.
Yep.
I know CMMC and frankly, many government-related regulatory things involve acronyms like SSPs and POAMs or POA and Ms. Talk to me about those quickly.
Yeah, so they're the SSP, the System Security Plan, is really kind of the foundational document of any CMMC or NIST 800-171 or FISMA NIST 853 compliance program. This is a document that, number one, clearly defines exactly what's in scope, what system you're trying to make compliant and all of its different bits and pieces and components and who's responsible for it. And then once you're done describing the system, now you need to describe all the security controls that you've put on that system. And really what that comes down to is this document will have one line for each CMMC, control requirement, I'm trying to say both words at the same time. It'll have one line for each CMMC requirement that explains whether it's applicable or not. If it's not applicable, well, why is it not applicable? And if it is applicable, what have you put in place to meet it? And just saying like, oh, antivirus. Yeah, we put antivirus in. Great. No, what antivirus have you put in? Where is it installed? How is it configured? You need that level of detail. The POAM is for when something is not compliant. It's a plan of action and milestones. And so that's another document that describes, here's the things that are not met right now. Here are our plans to meet them, and here's our timeline for doing so. And the POAMs are important because, number one, it helps demonstrate, it builds that paper trail that that you're doing your change control, you're working through things, and that's something that that CMMC looks for. But POAMs can also help you get certified when you are not yet compliant. So one of the things that's come out in the updates is they will let you certify, even though you have not met all of the requirements, as long as you produce POAMs for the requirements that you are not currently meeting. And there's a few caveats to that. So first up is there are some requirements that just can never be POAM'd. They're too important. Like you're not going to get certified if you don't have an SSP. The other thing is each of the requirements has a score assigned to it. Some of them are weighted heavier than others, and you have to have a certain minimum score to get certified. So depending on which requirements that you haven't met, you may or may not be above that threshold where you can be compliant with POAMs. And of course, you can game those scores and try to fix the ones you need to fix quickly to get up to the level where you pass the score, you can certify even though you haven't fixed all of them.
Yep.
The other big gotcha is if you get certified, your timeline for all these POAMs can be no longer than 180 days if you want to keep that certification. So you can't just put a POAM out there and say like, yeah, we'll get to this sometime in the next decade, which there was a lot of that under 800-171. Nope, there's a timeline now and they're going to hold you to it.
That's great.
Also worth mentioning, there are templates for both of these up on NIST's website, the NIST 800-171 website. Where's my web browser here? I can show right where this is.
And while you're pulling that up, I'll just say, I know we're getting close to time. So if anyone does have any questions that they want to lob at us, please hit us with them. Yeah, and there they are, Chris. So
yep. Yeah, so this is just the NIST 800-171 site. And you can see over on the side here, supplemental materials. You get a CUI plan of action template and a CUI SSP template. The SSP template will have all of the NIST 800-171 control numbers in them, which are just numbers. But hopping back over to my CMMC assessment, you'll notice that like this one has some letters and then 3.10.6. 3.10.6 is the NIST 800-171 number. CMMC just adds all this extra stuff in front of it. So you can easily map the 800-171 SSP template over to CMMC controls.
Perfect. I'm just going to mention two other things super quickly as we wrap up, because I think they can be thorny issues potentially. But given the time, we're not going to spend a lot of time on them. One, sometimes we hear people say, hey, I moved all my stuff to GovCloud or a service that is specifically designed for this stuff, and therefore I'm good, right? The short answer is no, you have to do some extra stuff. We are more than happy to talk to you about that extra stuff, but we can't do it in a minute. So we're not going to try. But if you have questions about that, hit us up and let us know.
The way I always put that one is that GovCloud is designed so that it can be CMMC compliant if you configure it correctly.
Right.
Other cloud services may not be able to be CMMC compliant no matter how hard you try.
Perfect. And also, hey, I know I have to be CMMC, so that means employees can't be remote anymore. Is that right? And that's actually not true. They can be, but again, you have to do some stuff. You have to address some stuff just to make sure that you're still checking all the boxes in a compliant way. Again, if you have questions about that stuff, let us know.
Yeah, this is the spot to look. This CMMC requirement is the one that applies to when they say alternate work sites, they're talking about people working remote. The example goes into detail on that. So when you're thinking remote workers, just go straight to this requirement.
Yep. And that's 2 o'clock on the dot. So hit the buzzer. But really appreciate everyone hanging out with us. This is stuff that we love helping people with. So if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, let us know directly, or touch base with your friendly TrustedSec sales rep and they'll get you in touch with us. But yeah, really appreciate it, everybody. And yeah, I don't see any questions, so I think we'll wrap it up. Take care, all.
Thanks.
Bye.